This chapter is on the nervous tissue. So the first thing we need to go over is the general organization of the nervous tissue. The nervous system is generally thought of as a control system. It contains all kinds of tissue types, but the two main types of tissue are neurons and glial cells. The nervous tissue can be divided both structurally and functionally. And the structural division is going to be between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous systems. The functional division would be between the sensory and the motor nervous systems. So the structural division has to do with whether it's located in the brain or spinal cord. That would be the central nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system would be located in the spinal nerves, everything that kind of leads to the brain or spinal cord, and everything that leads away from it. The functional systems would include the incoming signals, which would be the sensory signals, and the outgoing signals, which would include the motor nervous systems. This diagram shows us these two separate distinctions. So our first subdivisions include the central nervous system, which is abbreviated as CNS, and it includes the brain as well as the spinal cord. So you might say the central processing units, what makes the decision on the input and then decides what the output's going to be. The second structural subdivision is going to be the peripheral nervous system, abbreviated as PNS, and this is going to include cranial nerves, and there are 12 of them, spinal nerves, as well as ganglia. And we see those shown on the diagram on the right-hand side of your slide. For the functional differentiations, we have three major functions, the first of which is to collect information, and that would be the job of receptors that are in the peripheral nervous system. And they send stimuli changes that occur in the environment, pass that information on to the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. Then the processing and evaluation of that information occurs, and that's a job for the central nervous system, which is the brain or spinal cord. And then finally, there are responses that are initiated, where the central nervous system is going to initiate these impulses, which are rapid electrical charges, essentially, that the peripheral nervous system carries to effectors. So the different categories or functional organizations include first the sensory or afferent nervous system. And the word afferent means toward. So this part of the peripheral nervous system is conducting information to the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. And the sensory or afferent division can be further subdivided into two components, depending on where the information comes from. If it comes from the general senses, such as impulses from the skin, joints, skeletal muscles, special senses, touch, pain, or pressure, vibration, or what's called proprioception, it would be classified as somatic sensory. And specifically, it's conscious information that we are aware of. If it's subconscious information that we are not aware of, it's called visceral sensory. And it's called visceral because it's coming from organs. For example, blood vessels or viscera, organs like the stomach. So imagine a chemical receptor in your stomach is exciting a sensory nerve. The name of that sensory nerve is the visceral sensory nerve, and we are not conscious of it. It's automatically sending information to the brain. Information that leads away from the brain is classified as the motor or efferent nervous system. And efferent means away from. So it takes information away from the central nervous system through the peripheral nervous system to either muscles or glands. So it's responsible for output. And just like we saw with the sensory nerves, we also have two systems here. We have either somatic or we have autonomic motor. Somatic means that it is voluntary and it conducts impulses that cause contraction of skeletal muscles. If it has to do with the autonomic nervous system, which would be a system which happens automatically, we don't make a conscious decision to control it. Therefore, it's thought of as involuntary. In this case, it conducts impulses to regulate things like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, as well as specific glands. The organization of the skeletal muscle is on this slide. And I want you to notice we have kind of the organization of the functional structure that we talked about earlier. There's always going to be sensory input, which is also called the afferent. There's also going to be motor output, which is also called efferent. So you should know that those words mean the same thing, sensory and afferent, and motor means efferent. So depending on where the information is coming from, it's either somatic sensory, which means it's essentially conscious sensory input from many of the different types of receptors. It could include the 5 special senses, general receptors, or proprioceptors. If it's non-conscious information, it's going to be sensory input coming from the viscera, which would be organs like the heart or blood vessels or other internal organs. For the motor output, this is also going to be dependent on the type of information that is carried away from the central nervous system. If it's going to be motor output that goes to skeletal muscle, this would be voluntary information, meaning that our central nervous system is making the conscious decision to contract a skeletal muscle. However, if it's autonomic motor, then it would be information that we do not consciously decide. So information that controls the heartbeat, for example, that controls our blood pressure, may control smooth muscle that's in the blood vessels, as well as other glands.